This is how you make a slip knot. Make a loop with the tail hanging down in front. Take your needle, pop it into the loop and hook the tail, bringing it up through your loop. Grab both of your ends and pull to tighten. Once you have your slip knot on the needle, you can now begin to cast on. This is the knitted cast on method. You put your needle in from left to right to your first stitch. Make sure you don't use the tail, you want to use the working yarn that's coming from the ball, and you wrap it counterclockwise around the back needle. Pull that yarn through the loop and towards you, and then place it onto the left needle. Again, you go into the front of the stitch from left to right, wrap the yarn counterclockwise around that needle, pull the yarn through and place it on to the needle. One more. In, around, through, and onto the needle. And you continue doing this until you have all of the stitches cast on for your project. Another cast on method that I really like and use for most of my projects is the long tail cast on. What I do first with this method is figure out how many stitches I need, leaving a tail. I then wrap my yarn around the needle to calculate how much tail I'm going to need to make this stitch. So how many do I have here? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I have 14 stitches here. So say my project's 14 stitches. You keep wrapping around until you have the right number, or you can do it in lots of, say, 20 and then calculate it out. Pull this off. Place that spot on your needle, gripping it with your finger, with the tail hanging down in front and the yarn from the ball at the back. This is the tricky part, but once you get it, this method is really quick to cast on. So you need to grab the tail with your thumb and the working yarn from the ball in between your pointer finger and your middle finger. You then use your ring finger and your little finger to grab both the tail and the working yarn. So you're creating a bit of a, and then pulling it through, making a bit of a slingshot kind of look. So like this. Then you need to go with the needle under where your thumb is and over where your pointer is, and pull the loop through. Now with this method you don't need a slip knot, because that first piece that was just hanging over the needle becomes a stitch at the same time. So again, we've got the tail and we have the working yarn. We grab, go under at the thumb, over at the pointer, and then bring that caught yarn back through the loop created by your thumb and pull to tighten. You don't need to go too tight, the gap between the stitches is what gives you your flexibility, so be careful how closely you put the stitches on the needle. Again, make your slingshot, under with your thumb, over at your pointer, and pull through the loop created by your thumb and draw it tight. Under, over and through, under, over and through, under, over and through, under, over and through. And I said this can get quite quick once you get the method down. And then when you're ready to start, when you've cast on all your stitches, turn your work and begin knitting as normal. Once you've cast on the number of stitches you need for your project, you can begin to knit. The stitches you will work should be in your left hand and the empty needle in your right hand. Slide the stitches up close to the top of the needle. Put your right needle in from left to right and in front of the first loop. Wrap the yarn counterclockwise, pull the loop through, and then let the old stitch drop off. That's your brand new stitch here. In to the front and left to right, around, and pull it through. In, left to right, around, and pull it through and off. In, around, through, and off. And you can continue to do this across your row. When it calls for knitting, combining knit over each row of your knitting makes garter stitch, and to make stockinette stitch you need to learn the purl stitch, which I will show you in a separate video. So here we have another row of knit done. So to continue, you turn your work, put the empty needle into your right hand, the full needle in your left hand, and you continue as before to knit, placing the needle in through the front, yarn around, pull the loop through and drop it off. To purl, again you start with the stitches on the needle in your left hand and the empty needle in your right hand. To purl, you put the yarn from right to left into the stitch like that. Your yarn, working yarn, should be in the front, and you take the yarn counterclockwise around your needle, pull the loop to the back of the work and let the stitch drop off. So we put the needle into the front of the loop from right to left, wrap the yarn counterclockwise around that needle, pull your loop through the stitch to the back and drop the old stitch off, and there you have your stitches on the needle. through, around and off, through, around and off, in, around, back through the loop and off, in through the front from right to left, round the needle, back through the loop and off, in, around, through and off. And when you get to the end of the row, it's exactly the same as the knit stitch. You turn your work, put the empty needle into your right hand, and then you can choose to knit or purl here to continue your stitch pattern. Once you've mastered the knit and purl by themselves, you can then combine them together in a row depending on what your pattern says. So what you might do is start with knit, so you have your yarn at the back, in from left to right, wrap the yarn around, pull it through. Let's do another knit, in through the front, around and pull that off. And then to change to a purl, we bring the yarn to the front. We then put the needle through from right to left, wrap, pull through, in, wrap, pull through. To change back to knitting, we put the needle to the back of the work. We then put our right needle from left to right into the stitch, wrap, pull through, in, wrap, pull through. To change back to purl again, bring the yarn to the front, in from right to left, wrap and pull through, in from right to left, wrap and pull through, back to knitting, to the back, left to right, and in from left to right, and in, and we'll continue by finishing knitting across the rest of the row. And there we're able to change our stitches as we go. Once you have knit all of your project and you're at the end and you want to finish it off, you need to cast off or bind off. To do this, first stitch we will knit as normal, and the second stitch we will knit, second stitch we will knit as normal, and then using your needle point, lift the first stitch that you knit up and over the top of that second stitch. Then we've bind off one stitch. Then we knit one more stitch, take that first loop on the needle, bring it up and over the top, knit another stitch as normal, lift that first stitch up and over the top. You can see now forming that bind off through there. So we continue all the way across the row, knitting one stitch and then lifting the stitch up and over, knitting one, lifting up and over, knitting one, oh, lifting up and over, knitting one, lifting up and over, all the way to the end of the row. When you have one stitch left, you can pull your yarn, take the needle out, cut the yarn and leaving a tail, and pull that yarn through the loop, and that secures your end. Another bind off method that I really like is the Russian bind off, which is slightly different from the regular bind off that I showed in the previous video. It starts the same. You knit the first stitch as normal, and you knit the second stitch as normal, but instead of pulling this loop up and over like we did in the first bind off method, this time put your left needle into the front of those two stitches, put the yarn around and knit those two stitches together. What this does is just provides a little bit of extra yarn in that stitch and doesn't pull it too tight. So we go knit one more stitch, left needle into the front and down into those two stitches, around and off, knit, left needle down into those two stitches, wrap your yarn and pull the loop through. As you can see there, we've got a nice stretchy bind off edge happening, and we can continue doing that across the whole row and finish as we would for a regular bind off, cutting the yarn when we have one stitch left on the right hand needle and pulling that loop through the stitch to secure. Knit, and through, knit. There is the completed Russian bind off, and you can see it's quite stretchy. And this is a regular bind off, and see it doesn't have quite as much stretch. You can make it stretchy by doing it quite loose, but that gives you another option to make quite a stretchy bind off.